Thank you, Senator Steele-John. I'll call Senator Hughes.
Thank you, Madam Deputy President. The one thing that I think we can all agree on is the case of Anne-Marie Smith is heartbreaking. There is absolutely no way, with or without the NDIS, pre or post the NDIS, anywhere in our society, should this have been allowed to have happened. It is an absolutely appalling reflection on society as a whole that this woman was allowed to endure what she did and that has ultimately led to her death. And I think the more we think about it, it becomes even more and more incredulous that this was ever allowed to have occurred. We're talking about a woman with a profound disability, a woman who is unable to toilet herself, to shower herself, to feed herself, and at no point in what's alleged to have been 1 year was she taken out of a cane chair. I mean, how is this even possible? I mean, it is just extraordinary that for 1 year, a woman with a profound disability was left sitting in a chair, not even ever taken to the toilet, not showered. I mean, God knows what she was, and if she was ever fed. I mean, this is just abuse in every shape and form and an absolute abomination. But how did it occur? I mean, how can anyone who purports to be a service provider or carer allow this to happen and to persist? Because what we have seen is one woman charged with her manslaughter, with Anne-Marie Smith's manslaughter, because allegedly there was one carer allocated to Anne-Marie Smith. Now, we know that she was in this chair for a year. So if she had one carer that was due to come to her 3 times a day, why was it only one person? Did this woman never have a day off? Did this woman never have a holiday? Did she work 7 days a week for that year? I still think there are a lot of questions to the provider, who I understand has been struck off as being a provider to NDIS services. But I still think there are questions that need to be asked as to how does that provider ever allow a situation where a severely, profoundly disabled woman was in a situation where one woman was in charge of her care, no one else has accepted responsibility, because how can one carer who has now been charged and pled guilty to the manslaughter ultimately have been responsible for 365 days plus of care, 7 days a week, with no other person visiting the house? So we probably know that woman didn't go all the time. But the provider, that organisation, should have, of course, been up to the task and ensured that there was more than one provider attending to this woman. I'm sure they have a roster where staff are rostered on and off, so who else was put on in place? So I think there are significant things that need to be looked at with some of these providers, and we do need to ensure that providers are not given an opportunity to be allowed to throw all the blame on one carer employed by them, or in some cases I believe they're claiming this was subcontracted to them, when you are talking about 365 7-day-a-week care to be provided. I mean, it is just absolutely extraordinary. And I do welcome that the NDIA and this bill will provide more oversight, more opportunities for us to ensure that these situations are never allowed to occur again. But it is important, when we look at the context of the NDIS, that part of the Tier 2 supports that are supposed to be in place, the Tier 2 that unfortunately hasn't to this stage been, I think, a high enough priority, but I do commend the Minister is now taking a much more serious look at the Tier 2 community supports part of the NDIS becoming a reality. The community supports were designed to ensure that not only for those that could participate or wanted to participate in community activities outside disability providers, that those organisations could receive training, guidance, communication on how best to deal with that person with a disability who wants to use their services, but that there's more community awareness, that there's more community acceptance and understanding of what people with a disability require. And I think where we see these shortfalls in our community, we know, and we've talked about it through COVID, loneliness is real and it is a scourge in our community. People have really felt loneliness, through isolation, through lockdowns. You know, when we saw that people weren't allowed to interact, people that were living alone, it took state government some convincing that perhaps they should allow friend bubbles or single bubbles so that people were not forced to isolate alone. We've talked about this in this place many times, and I know we don't have any direct figures, but I'm sure we will learn them over time, what the consequences have been of some of the desperation and loneliness that people have felt through enforced isolation via COVID. And you can only imagine the isolation and loneliness that was experienced by Anne-Marie Smith, who some of her own neighbours in the street, we have to understand she didn't live in a group home. She was living in a home that had been provided by her parents prior to their death. And the neighbours in that street, some had not seen her for a decade. The ones that had seen her more recently were saying they hadn't seen her for 5 years. And as a society, how do we say that's acceptable? How do we say that we haven't seen the disabled woman that we know lives alone, parents have died, no longer sitting in her front yard, no longer sitting in her driveway with her dogs, where they used to regularly see her sitting in the sun, and that at no point someone has said, clearly something is amiss here. So we need to do better as a society, and I know that we as a government and even everyone in this place looks to legislate how we can improve things, how we can provide frameworks, how we can ensure that organisational failures like this aren't allowed to occur, and when they do, punishments are significant and immediate. But we cannot enforce community standards in the way that I would have hoped her neighbours might have kept a little bit more of an eye out. When they hadn't seen her for a while, might have thought to just ring the police and say, can you do a bit of a welfare check? I know as my office rang round a lot of areas, checking in with some of our older constituents, we quite often sent police round to homes under very distressing circumstances to do welfare checks on people who were not coping with the isolation. But it is absolutely demonstrative of how some in our society have very little care or regard for their neighbours, and it is something that I think we can all look to do better. And I think it also points to one of the other issues. I know today the independent assessment report from the Joint Standing Committee is being tabled at around midday, and that again, to the Minister's credit, has now been disbanded as an idea, but it is something about how we need to look at what functionality needs to be assessed, how we look at goals, how we ensure people are achieving them. Because I'm pretty sure if someone had actually gone to see Anne-Marie Smith, they would have understood that one of her goals was to sit out in the sun with her dogs in the front yard, what she used to do, and that functionality, those goals need to be supported so that people have an insurance that they can live a quality of life that they should. And unfortunately, what we have seen as we've moved away from the group homes, as we've moved away from the old block funding model, and as I said in my maiden speech, this was always going to be something we were going to have to continue to tweak to make it fit for purpose. It is such a huge and fundamental change. It is the biggest social reform since Medicare. It was always going to take time to make sure that we ironed out the kinks, got it right, made sure that we were delivering it in the best way possible. But when we hear about sustainability, if there has ever been an example why parents and carers of people with a disability are some of the people most focused on ensuring the sustainability and correct running of this scheme, is Anne-Marie Smith. Because if her parents had known when they passed that this level of neglect would be allowed to occur, that is the fear of every parent of a child with a disability. We need to know that our children are going to be supported well after we are gone, and that is why there is no one more focused on scheme sustainability than the parents and carers of a loved one with a disability. Because we need to know that once we're gone, they will be safe, they will be cared for, they will have a quality of life, and that someone, and of course, you know, maybe not love them in the same way your own family does, but that they will be appreciated, that they will be supported, and they will enjoy a quality of life that they should. And I think that's why we know, and I commend Senator Steele-John and the work that I've done with him on the Joint Standing Committee for the NDIS, along with Kevin Andrews, the member for, and I'm going to get in trouble because I can't remember the name of his seat, but I'm looking to, Menzies, the member for Menzies. I'm looking to a Victorian across the chamber, the member for Menzies, but as well as Senator Brown. This area is one that is genuinely, I feel, bipartisan. It is one that we can work together because we are working to the betterment not only of the people currently on the scheme, the people that require the scheme and their families, but I think we all appreciate that this is a scheme for every Australian because you just never know when you might need it. So I support this bill, I commend this bill, and I absolutely hope to continue working with all colleagues across the chamber from every team and with the Minister to ensure that the NDIS is as fit for purpose as it can be and that people that require it are supported and are supported in a way that gives them dignity and a true quality of life.